Good morning, everyone. I'm John Flanders. I'm the president of Special Education Equity for Kids of Connecticut, better known as SEEK. And I want to welcome you to this special edition of SEEK This Week, or SEEK Speaks. As you are all aware, the Trump administration is preparing an executive order to eliminate or seriously curtail the United States Department of Education. To look at the implications of that and the mechanisms for that, we are very pleased to have Professor Eleanor Schiff of Yale University. Professor Schiff is a lecturer in American political institutions with a focus on interbranch interactions with the federal bureaucracy, policymaking dynamics, particularly in education, and extra institutional actors' influence on the bureaucracy. Uh, with me on the program, we have our own Andy Feinstein, who is the chair of our Advocacy and Legislative Committee, and Dana Jonson, who will be doing a special ed attorney, who will be doing much of the discussion with Professor Schiff. A little housekeeping before we begin. Uh, this is a new venue for us at Seek, so we had some problems with going on Facebook Live, so we're moved on to this. Please forgive any glitches that come through. Second, there are a number of lawyers on your screen. Uh, that none of them is going to give you legal advice, and nothing should be interpreted as that. Finally, we are going to be accepting questions, and we have people monitoring the chat. So as time permits, we will allow that. We suggest that you keep your questions as generic as possible, lest you give information on an individual to the rest of the world. Finally, SEEK is an institution dedicated to education, advocacy, and improving systematic change for kids with disability. This is a full-time job, and we are very active at the legislature and in various venues around the state. This requires money, so I strongly encourage you to consider renewing your membership to SEEK if you are a professional, joining the organization, or making a donation, and you can find access on our website. Nobody wants to hear me talk, so I'm going to turn it over to Dana to begin our discussion, and thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. Andy and I had the pleasure of meeting Eleanor, I think, last year at an event at Yale. So thank you, Eleanor, so much for joining us. Um, we have a lot to kind of cover in a short period of time, so I'll jump into it. I want to say that this is not just about, to anyone listening, this is not just about dismantling the Department of Education, but it's a broader effort to sort of shrink the federal government's role in education and put it to the states. So, short of dismantling it, there's still other things that can happen to weaken the department's powers or oversight and funding. So, Eleanor, I was hoping we could kind of start with why the dismantling of the Department of Ed requires congressional approval and what that process would look like. Are there any historical precedents of efforts to eliminate the Department of Ed? And why is that more challenging than I think some of us know?
Well, it was obviously created by Congress, and it can't just be wished away by executive order. There's a lot that can be done with executive order, but you can't just shut down. This is different than what happened with USAID. The department has always had kind of a rocky relationship, often with Republicans, because when it was created in 1979, a lot of people didn't. Education has always been a state and local issue viewed that way. And, Reagan really wanted to shut down the department, and he couldn't get it done, partly because the Nation at Risk report was issued in 1983, but he had a hard time getting it done, and he didn't have the votes in Congress. So I mean, it could happen, but it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to shut down a cabinet agency, and it would require the consent of Congress and would require a 60-vote cloture vote in the Senate, which is very hard to do too. So it can be done, but it's hard.
Yeah,
very
it's not as easy as just waving a magic
Well, I just
wand.
want to add that, there is a precedent. There was a Department of Education created by President Andrew Johnson in 1868, and it was shut down shortly thereafter. So there is precedent for shutting down the Department of Education.
Yeah, but I think it's not as easy as it sounds, right? There's no magic
Right.
wand that's going to wave and suddenly it's going to go away. And I think what is a larger concern, at least from my perspective, is the executive actions that could weaken it.
Yes.
Um, so even if it's not fully dismantled, what kind of executive actions could a president take to weaken the authority of the Department of Education? Like defunding, reorganize.
Yeah. So a president, the way a president can control or exert authority over any bureaucracy is through executive action, through executive orders, right? Appointment power. So the political appointees that are at Ed will largely work to fulfill a president's agenda. There aren't that many political appointees at the Department of Education, but they lead all of the major offices and departments. Uh, Budgeting is the biggest way that a president can weaken the department. And we saw that a little bit yesterday with the pulling of the contracts and funding for ed research, and working to sort of zero out some budgeting for different offices could severely cripple the department. But again, budgeting is a shared responsibility by the Congress and the president. Trump has just, unlike any other president we've had, obviously, and his rhetoric yesterday was about the Impounding Act of 1974 that Congress instituted after Watergate, and saying that he has a right not to spend the money that Congress has already appropriated to those offices. So, I mean, that's very problematic. So budgeting is the major way, I think.
What about
Let
halting?
me add two things
Oh,
on that.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yep.
First, Trump did fire the DEI people at the Department of Education. Whether he had any authority to do so is a really serious question.
Right.
But he has effectively done that, and I'm not sure what the legal authority is. Now, the Budget Control and Empowerment Act of '74 is extraordinarily complicated. Generally, the rule is if Congress appropriates, the president has to spend, but that's not without exceptions. And so it's not as clean as the abolition of the department type question might be.
And I'll also just say that, obviously this is going to be going through the courts, and lawsuits have already been filed in the first 2 weeks. The courts, though, are not they sometimes cannot be a very effective check on the executive, because the courts don't have any enforcement power. They rely on the executive branch to enforce their decisions. So that's a little bit of a concern too.
Well, can you talk a little bit about the constitutional crisis emerging if what Vance said over the weekend is in fact their position, that that the courts can't enforce it, and we're going to ignore what we don't believe is the court making that?
Well, I mean, there's ample precedent for presidents not really abiding by or ignoring Supreme Court decisions. I mean, Brown v. Board of Education was largely ignored. And it took executive action with the passage of ESEA in 1965 to actually desegregate the schools. So, it's certainly a humongous shakeup to how we think of government and the three branches of government interacting.
Andy, any thoughts on that?
Well, no, it is. I mean, I also have the real litigation issues. You have to show harm to bring an action, and besides employees who lose their job, I don't know who suffers harm by the closure of the Department of Education, or at least judicially cognizable harm. The courts have sort of skirted those issues so far in terms of the 5 or 6 injunctions that have been issued. But I do think that issue does exist on challenging it, and and then there's a much more serious issue in all these cases of how do you craft the remedy um, if the president were to appoint, say, a female wrestling star to be the Secretary of Education, just hypothetically, and tells her to do nothing with that position. What is the remedy? Is the remedy to appoint a special master to run the Department of Education? That seems to be pretty extreme. I don't know what, even if the courts did find it improper and did rule against it,
Yeah.
I don't know how to craft a remedy.
Right. No, you raise a really important point, Andy. If if the Trump administration basically says cease and desist all work, that is very problematic.
Well, and that would also go to halting the enforcement, right? So they could stop the enforcement of IDEA, Title IX, that could impact us as well, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
I also, I think America, education is typically a very bipartisan issue. Lots and lots of politicians, H.W. Bush ran on being the education president, and there was a whole swath of governors, Republican and Democratic, who ran on being the education governor. And it's education is something that's so personal to so many Americans and touches so many aspects of our society that I think that there will be also a huge amount of blowback, both in the Congress and also with the nation's governors too. And so I think that there will be more fierce resistance to it.
well, let me just also say, in terms of the IDEA, the single most important feature of it is the private right of action. And nothing that the administration does can take away that private right of action. And that's where the enforcement of IDEA ultimately lies.
Well, doesn't that, I would ask you and Dana. So, you guys deal with these issues every day on the ground, but at the local and school district level, they're the street level bureaucrats responsible for implementing these federal laws, to help kids. Do you see any enforcement action being taken back at the district level for these federal laws that are on the book?
I see districts backing away from DEI efforts to avoid any conflict with the administration.
Okay.
But in terms of the preservation of special ed and the rights of special education, we are completely in lockstep with school administration officials.
Yeah.
And they're concerned about loss of funding,
Right.
although Connecticut gets a very, very small portion of federal funds.
Right.
It's nationwide, about 13% of special education is funded by the federal government. In Connecticut,
Right.
it's 6%.
Yes.
So, there could be some loss of funding, and that, of course, hits mainly Title I schools, which are schools with impoverished kids in it, and those are in the cities. That's a large area of concern. But in terms of running the system, in terms of the underlying IDEA laws, in terms of the underlying rights of kids, I don't see any retrenchment at the local level. That said, however, there are some local school boards that are quite in lockstep with the administration on this, and may try to cut funding on the local level. We haven't seen a lot of that in Connecticut quite yet. We've seen it in other states, but that is a possibility. But that's not because of anything that the Trump administration does,
Yeah.
except for
Right.
local people supporting that.
Yeah, and I think you raised a really important point about the funding. The nationwide, the national average is only about 10% federal funding for school districts, and there's wide variation, actually across within states too. So funding still is predominantly at the state and local level for schools. When ESEA was passed in 1965, the Title I funding affected 94% of congressional districts. That's one of the reasons Jonson was able to get it passed, to convince people to have a more muscular federal role in education. And that also would be really difficult politically if some of that Title I funding is is pulled for, it would touch almost every single member of Congress and their districts. And that is going to be that would also provoke a huge backlash, I think.
Can you talk a little bit about Title I and who gets it and on what basis they get it, and that it's this education generally, it's not special ed?
Yeah. So Title I is just, that's the name of the act in the elementary and secondary school act that was passed in 1965. And this was, as you all probably know, part of the Great Society program from Jonson, really aimed at alleviating poverty. And so it is that's the major part of the funding for in the act and the later reauthorizations of NCLB and the Every Student Succeeds Act. But it's a formula-based funding based on the poverty level of the district. And so at the time it was passed, of course, the northern states were like, gosh, all the southern states are going to get all this money to our detriment. And that's kind of what happened, because the northern states have always been much better and much more committed to having higher pure pupil expenditure in their districts, and they have taxed their citizens, as you well know, to that effect. So a lot of Title I funding goes to almost every congressional district in the country, and it is really aimed at a poverty reduction in schools as part of Jonson's vision to ensure equity of equality of opportunity for all students.
But let me just say that Title I runs to the school.
Yes.
That if the school has a certain proportion of kids meeting the threshold, it's a very complicated test. The threshold for Title I, it becomes a Title I school. And remarkably, there's Title I schools in Greenwich, Connecticut.
Yes.
So it's not just the Bridgeport and Hartfords that have Title I schools. They're throughout the state.
Well, I think to bring it back to sort of the IDEA, because I think that's important, but I think that also, we're talking about with the funding and stuff that could be impacted through the IDEA. I just lost my train of thought. I'm really sorry. But I think what I wanted to ask was, we're hoping it doesn't get dismantled, but I do think it's important to note that we have survived without the Department of Education before. So let's just say hypothetically that does happen, where would these enforcement agencies go? Like, who would enforce these acts?
So, I mean, it would just depend how the executive reorganization happened. So in 1953, there was a department called Health, Education, and Welfare, and that administered, the federal role was pretty small until the passage of ESEA in 1965. But the Health, Education, and Welfare Office was pretty powerful, right? It did all of what now HHS does, administered Social Security, and it smoothly administered, and the Office of Civil Rights was under the Office of Education there, administered ESEA and basically enforcing Title IV of the Civil Rights Act to desegregate the school. So worked in lockstep with the Justice Department. And so there still would need to be offices to administer IDEA and CLB, working with the states on their programs. So it just depends where the administration would propose having it moved. It could go to HHS, could go to the Department of Labor. When the Department of Education was created, it was actually a very narrow creation in terms of the offices that were brought to the department. So Head Start is obviously still at HHS. There's a lot of human services that touch education. The school lunch program is at Ag. There's a lot of things that could have been brought over and made it kind of a larger, more powerful department, but it wasn't. It was a very narrowly created department, and it was relatively not as, I don't want to say not as powerful as the other cabinet agencies. So if there is an executive reorganization, IDEA could probably go to HHS or labor, because there is a lot of duplication in terms of some of the programs that labor does and ed in terms of workforce training. And so in some ways that some of that could be more streamlined, but it would just depend on where they propose to put it.
Let me talk a little bit about this notion of enforcement. So the basic concept of IDEA, at least from the point of view of the feds, is we give you a bunch of money and you agree to comply with our law. The proposal in Project 2025 is is that it be a block grant. Now, what kind of restrictions are on that block grant, whether a requirement of compliance with the law is part of that, is a huge legal question. As if there's a movement towards block granting IDEA, the enforcement of IDEA, while theoretically the Department of Education ensures that states comply with it, there has been no enforcement action by the Department of Education against the state in the history of the IDEA. And so that's a complete myth that the Department of Education enforces the IDEA. Enforcement, to the extent that it is private right of action. And then finally, in terms of your point about the limited scope of the Department of Education, it was very clear in the debate creating the Department of Education that education remains fundamentally a local issue and that there would be no federal curriculum.
Right.
And that is, and that's really the nub of the fight here. I mean, the nub of the conservative argument against the Department of Education is the federal government is playing too large a role in local education, and we're going to make them back off. And so, and indeed, even in special ed, while there's a requirement that you use research-based educational devices, which we know doesn't exist or aren't used, there's no curricular requirements particularly. And
when I think one of the larger concerns is OCR, right? So the Office of Civil Rights, and where is that going to go, and policy letters. And I mean, we know in the last term, a whole bunch of guidance was revoked, right? And I mean, by last term, I mean Trump's last term. I think that's a primary concern, is where is that going to go? And somebody just commented, Diane just commented that, 0 investigations have been opened up in OCR since 120, right? That's a concern.
And Project 2025 was quite clear that OCR would go to the Department of Justice.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Is that where that would go?
Well,
and where does that put us? Does that put us backwards? I mean, do we have to start the learning curve all over again? I don't know.
I don't know what my answer is, which is that
I know what's your answer, Andy.
The Department of Justice isn't going to do it.
Yeah,
and they've made it quite clear in terms of what they've done so far in terms of civil rights enforcement. So it's and perhaps Professor Schiff could comment on this. There is nothing in the law that requires them to be vigilant enforcers of the civil rights law, is there?
No. I mean, the laws are on the books, but it depends on the bureaucrats administering the program to do that. So it sort of depends on how much attention they want to pay to that, and that often varies by administration to administration. But this is something Dana and Andy, you and I were discussing over email, and I was asking you, because you guys are the people on the ground, to what extent does I mean, I think also the proposal is to just put much more of the responsibilities back on the states. And to what extent, is the Connecticut Department of Education helping to enforce IDEA and bring equity for the IDEA kids, special ed kids?
Andy, you want to take that?
We've had complaints for years about the fecklessness of the Connecticut State Department of Education. They see themselves much more as management consultant to school districts than an enforcement agency. And it would take, we've been pressing the legislature to both fund and mandate the Department of Education to oversee the activities of districts and to follow up on systemic complaints and the like. There's been some action in that area, but clearly that is the venue for action for us.
Yeah.
So I think there's a slant towards school districts, right? There's a presumption that they're doing the right thing. At least that's been my experience. I don't know about anyone else's.
But I think that is an avenue to pursue if you can strengthen the Connecticut Department of Education to make them much harder on districts, and to provide more oversight and enforcement.
Our problem, is that the structure of IDEA makes it virtually impossible to do any systemic challenges of what a district will do. I mean,
Okay.
unless it's a written policy. And so it's individual case by individual case, and that's a slow way to enforce compliance.
Yeah.
But our single number one most powerful tool is the individual right of action, is the due process case, and that's got to be where our focus is.
So Andy, I have a question for you on that. So, you go through a hearing, say, and you win or you lose, and somebody appeals it, and I think typically everyone goes to federal court. Would you advise differently? Would there be a shift in that if not necessarily the Department of Ed is dismantled, it could be dismantled, or if it's just, the gradual defunding and, the lack of enforcement, would you recommend appealing in state court instead of federal court? Because we do have most of the IDEA is codified in Connecticut law, and we do have one of the better states. Like, we do expand on the rights in Connecticut from the IDEA. So what are your thoughts on that?
We do have the choice. I've taken cases more to state court now. I like the federal court procedures better, but I think if it's a relatively circumscribed type case, I think you're gonna get pretty consistent rulings of federal district judges. It's only those big cases and the rights cases that are likely to go up, and the Supreme Court has already tipped its hand on where it is on that, and I think rather than worrying about whether we can expand the rights of transsexual youth, I think we've got to be thinking about protecting Bostic and the right to gay marriage. I mean, I think this real area of regression about to take place, and I would certainly advise against taking a case of that sort to the up above the district court level on the federal side.
That's depressing. Sorry, I don't have anything else to say on that. But so what, sorry, go ahead, Eleanor.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's no mention of education in the U.S. Constitution, which is another reason people have always, said there should be much more limited federal role. In every single state in this country, there is a mention of education in every state constitution, and it is viewed as an entitlement that the state must provide to kids. And you guys are, I don't know Connecticut law, but I would imagine that there's a lot in Connecticut law in terms of what the school's rights are and what kids' rights are, and particularly with IDEA. And Connecticut, I'm sure, has a much wider and range of those laws than a lot of other states.
Well, and Connecticut expands on the rights to some degree.
Yeah,
I mean, there are certain areas that we expand on. Not all states do that. I think that one of the larger issues we're going to have, even if it's not fully dismantled and we're just talking about reducing the power of the Department of Education, is state to state, it's gonna vary drastically.
Yes.
Well, I want to make two comments on Connecticut. First, one of the big things in Connecticut is that disability is a suspect category in Connecticut, meaning that the 2 or 3 tier analysis of equal protection law, disability is not a protected class on the federal level, and so it's reasonable basis analysis rather than strict scrutiny in Connecticut, because it is a suspect category. It should be a strict scrutiny analysis, which should give us much better handle on disability rights cases in Connecticut. As to the constitutional provision guaranteeing a right to a free education, the court, the Connecticut Supreme Court, back in the days of Horton versus Meskel, found a lot of meat in that and used that as the basis for it. When we get up to 2010 and the Supreme Court's throwing out of the CCJEF case, they're seeing a lot less potency to that. And so, I mean, those of us who have been fighting in terms of equity, we've been talking for years about another case, sort of like Horton or like Schiff, to deal with the wide inequity in Connecticut in school funding.
Yes.
And and seeing whether the Connecticut courts are willing to move back to creating more vitality to that constitutional provision. But the other thing is that under Connecticut law, local school boards are entities of the state, not of the municipality. It's a very confused situation. and that could also be used to dictate policy. So there's the seeds are there. We just have to fertilize them and make them grow.
Excellent point.
Yeah, what do from both of you? I'm curious. What do we think is going to happen? What is the more likely scenario of what we are going to be facing? Because there are a lot of options, right? And I know that no one has a crystal ball, and we have no idea that for all we know, the administration could get distracted by something shiny tomorrow. But let's assume they don't. What are some of the most likely scenarios of the direction we would be headed in?
Let me go first, Eleanor, because I
You
just
go
had a
first.
conversation with Dana. The shiny object theory, I think, is not valid in this case, because it's not President Trump who cares about this. It's all these guys who are surrounding him, who have been fighting for years against the U.S. Department of Education, and the Russell votes, and those guys aren't going anywhere, and they're the ones who really want to destroy the Department of Education. And so,
true, but he does have some control over where he disperses his resources, right? Like he does have
maybe Elon had that.
maybe.
Yeah,
Okay.
who knows? So I mean, and it's I think separate. Let's remove the question of this being the aberrant administration, that completely out of a historical administration. The trend is, frankly, away from federal control of education and back towards state control of education. That is, and how that happens remains to be seen. But that's where the action is going to be, and that's where we've got to focus our attention. And I'm not suggesting that we lie down and die over on the federal level, but I do think that our focus has got to be on the state level. And yes, things are going to get really ugly in Florida and Texas, but at the same time, things could get really quite nice in Connecticut.
Andy, I just want to back up a little and ask you one question, because there was a good question in the chat, which was, if we bring a case in well, it's saying federal court, but I think state court, do you risk the route under the IDEA and Connecticut statutes? Do you still run the risk of removal to federal court? What are your thoughts on that?
I think I need to do legal research on that. I mean,
Okay.
Generally the view is that you have the option of where to bring it, and the removal power is fairly broad, but with the new view, with the new more constrained view of a lot of the federal court judges, I'm not sure it's going to be asserted quite so broadly. I'm not sure. Yes, of course, there could be a motion to remove, but I'm not sure you lose those in every case, and I'm not even sure that our friends on the other side are necessarily would be inclined to seek removal.
Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to get that out there. I thought it was a good question. Sorry, Eleanor, I think I interrupted you.
Oh, no, I was just trying to answer your question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's supposed to take an act of Congress, right? If this large reorganization were to happen, and to move some of these IDEA office to somewhere else. But it also is going to come down to, I think, some of the budgeting issues, and if the political appointees who are heading, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education basically kind of don't do anything. So that sort of remains to be seen. And none of the political appointees the education secretary hasn't been approved, and none of the people below her have as yet. So we're a little bit of a holding pattern to see what they do.
Eleanor, can you talk about what the Department of Education has to do and what they can do? What is it they really have to do under statute?
Well, they're supposed to, administer the statutes that are on the books that the Congress has passed, right? And that's why all these offices have been created to work with the states on constructing, their education plans, to get the federal flow through funds down to the states. The department does a lot of working really closely with state governments and make sure they're, the testing requirements that started in NCLB and were codified in elementary and secondary, the Every Student Succeeds Act under the Obama administration. So that's a lot of what they do. And they're supposed to be following what the federal laws are on the books that the Congress has passed. And obviously civil rights enforcement.
Well, wait. I want to ask about that. You use the term administer. That administer does not mean enforce, does it? I mean, and you just talked about how they work with the states,
right?
And so they could say, yeah, we've decided that the states really are the fount of all wisdom on this, and we're going to take a back seat, and that
they could do
probably be consistent with the term administering, and probably not be consistent with the term enforcing.
Right. You're right.
Well, I think that's one of the concerns, right? Is that they don't dismantle the department, but the department doesn't do anything.
Right.
Or it doesn't have the power to do anything, or doesn't fund anything. And like you said, Andy, we don't have a ton of funding. The state funds a lot, so maybe we're in okay shape, maybe we're not. I can't imagine things are going to get easier.
Well, I do want to raise a question about that. The presumption about the Department of Education and the federal role, and that was that the Fed stay out of curriculum. Yet, on the second day of the Trump administration, we had his longest to history executive order, maybe the longest executive order in history, talking about how schools have to teach the greatness of America.
Oh God!
And
sorry,
can you comment on the curricular mandates being imposed by the Trump administration?
The federal government has no role in curriculum, zero. So, I mean, that was, I thought, unbelievably misguided and showed no understanding about how curriculum is developed, and it's all through the states.
So it's basically a useless executive order.
Yeah.
Well, wait, is it? I mean, if states are reliant on the federal government for some grants, if they're reliant on the federal government for all sorts of things, and this sort of curricular mandate comes out from the White House, isn't a state official at least well advised to consider it before taking actions that might endanger the state's revenue?
But even if it's not dismantled, there's going to be at least a gradual defunding, right? I don't think the states ultimately are going to be getting so much funding from the federal government that they're going to be motivated to follow that ridiculous order.
Well,
that's just my thought.
Let's hear what Professor Schiff has to say.
Sorry.
No, I mean, I agree with you, Dana. I mean, I don't. The federal government has never been involved in curriculum, and that has been one of the big political fights, right? That there's too much federal encroachment and there's top-down administration. And I mean, the closest thing we had to a more unified curriculum was the Common Core state standards. And that was not even developed by the feds. It was developed by the National Governors Association and the chief state school officers. And states had to sign on to that. And those mandated standards, not curriculum. But curriculum is always, it's not something the feds get involved in, or historically speaking. It's always been at the state and local area.
But there is still federal Department of Education discretionary funding that's given by grants to states, right?
Yes.
And if a state is, I mean, I don't know if you saw this, but the Department of Transportation put out a letter to all the governors 2 weeks ago saying that the transportation funds would be dispersed based on the birth rate of the county and birth and marriage rate of the county, among the two other factors. And another factor was compliance with edicts against DEI.
Right.
And so, it is entirely possible that the Department of Education discretionary grant funds could also depend on a state's compliance with the wishes of the Trump administration in terms of curriculum, right?
I guess. I mean, it's just not an area that the feds have ever been involved in, curriculum. But,
I mean, anything can happen, right? I mean,
Right,
we're
right,
learning that in real time.
right.
Anything
I mean, there's been a
can
lot of
happen.
whiplash the last 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that there, to the extent that it's possible, there are a lot of organizations out there that are prepared to litigate, right? They're waiting for these things to happen so that they can jump into court and stop them, as we've also seen in the last 2 weeks.
But the feds are also, they're not in the business of like traveling to school districts to check on,
Yes.
civics curriculum. And that's not what the feds do. And they don't have the manpower for that. And it's not what they do. That's what the state departments of education are supposed to be overseeing the districts.
And I think one of the problems they're going to have, particularly in Connecticut, is that to follow some of these curriculum suggestions, I'll call them, could eliminate a lot of AP classes that are offered by high schools. And I think we saw that as a problem in Florida before. And, that I don't know that Connecticut's going to jump on board with eliminating a whole bunch of AP classes that kids rely on and take. So there may be other states that don't care. But I think that that's going to be a driving force too. I mean, regardless of what parents think, if you start telling parents their kids can't take certain AP courses, they're going to go ballistic.
They're going to go ballistic. And just like I said at the start, education is just such like a personal issue to almost all Americans and voters. And this could provoke a huge backlash. 61% of Americans do not want the Department of Education dismantled. And so, we'll see, but I think this could provoke a big backlash.
Someone just asked if federal involvement in curriculum would have to be codified in legislation. Would it have to be? Can it be done through the executive order? I mean,
I don't
and
think
it wouldn't
it
get that
needs to be
far.
codified, no, by Congress, but it's just that has been the area where there's been the most fights for people saying this is just too much federal involvement, and there should be states need to be able to modify curriculum based on their workforce needs. Texas, for instance, has 2 years of Texas history that they teach in the public schools. I mean,
Yeah.
and I'm sure my kids are too old now, but I'm sure Connecticut has some version of Connecticut history that gets taught in 4th grade or whatever. So, it's just
Colonial times. We always
right,
cover colonial
exactly,
times. Yeah.
exactly. So
we also have the
I
mandate
don't think,
to teach the Irish potato famine in Connecticut schools. That's a Connecticut statute. So
yeah, interesting.
very
So,
important.
like hypothetically, no, I don't think that it would have to be codified by statute if they were going to roll out a national curriculum, but that's just not going to happen.
So how do we prepare for this, right? What do we do? I know, when I'm talking to parents, my recommendation is, and you guys can tell me your thoughts on it, is to focus on the local, right down to your school board.
Yeah.
Focus on putting pressure on your school board. Think about how your vote goes and show up for votes. Or elections, I'm sorry, show up for elections and use the vote. But what else can parents be doing, or we as advocates and attorneys be doing to prepare or pivot? Any
I
thoughts?
think there's a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot you can do. I would call your congressional representatives every day. I would call the governor's office. I would call anybody who is in a position of authority and make your voices known and have your organization be a powerful spokesman for special ed kids. And I mean, nobody wants to, hurt those kids at all. I mean, make your voices heard, vote. And I think that I worked in the Senate briefly. It's my first job out of college. And I was answering phones, and, members of Congress care what their constituents think. So it's very important to make your voice heard and to vote.
Well, and I know Chris Murphy said once, he said, even if I'm voting your way, make those calls, because they need to justify why they are doing what they're doing. And if they can't show the numbers of the calls that they're getting and the overwhelming, perspective of their constituents, then even if we know that we know that he agrees with us, we still need to give them that support.
Yeah. Yeah. And also just working, I think, at the local level and strengthening, the Connecticut Department of Education, And having your state lawmakers know what you think too. That's also really important.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
but I also
I
think
would
that
be remiss in my job as president of SEEK to just point out that we have an organization that is doing that. And I strongly recommend that all of you follow what we're doing and reach out to us with your ideas and your support on those
Right.
issues.
Right. And you're an extremely important voice in
I
this.
also think that you know, we in the opposition are powerless in the executive branch, virtually powerless in the legislative branch, and appearing to be fairly powerless in the judicial branch, and increasingly powerless in the news media. So where's our power? Our power comes in community organizing. Our power comes in people, and you know, polls that show that the majority of people don't approve of what the administration's doing aren't going to have an effect. People on the streets are going to have an effect. People making noise are going to have an effect, and so I think that's where the bulwark is in terms of popular organizing and loud noises.
And Andy, we were talking about this a little bit over email, but the state attorneys generals are also very important. I mean, a lot of what they do every day is sue the federal government. And, that is going to be an important group also to have for states to be working together, and state attorneys general to make their voices heard as well. But governors, I think, are also important because you guys probably remember it was the Republican governors who stepped up during Trump's first term when he was trying to kill Obamacare. And they basically said, this is like, if you do this, it's going to blow up our budget, because a lot of states' budget is on Medicaid. Right. And so I think having the governors involved too in this effort is very important.
Well, we in Connecticut, we are very fortunate that Attorney General Tong has been one of the really most outspoken leaders on this subject. And in terms of letters of support, he probably could use some at this point. He's getting bludgeoned, and but he's really been a leader on that. The governor, in his budget address, really poked fun at the Trump administration, but so his heart's in the right place. Whether he wants to be he was quoted as saying to some people that why don't we let San Francisco and Chicago take the heat on DEI before they come after us, which may not be an unwise proposition. So how much he's willing to take them on directly, I don't know, but that's where the sources of power are in the state. At least to date, we've seen no such vital signs in the Department of Education in the state.
Okay.
Is there anything we haven't covered?
Okay, we got questions, Dana.
I think I brought them up as we were talking.
Okay.
I'm not sure there are a ton. If anybody does have a specific question, please do pop it in to the chat, because we would happily answer them with our esteemed opinions.
The one thing I meant to mention, I was just looking at some of the questions from earlier. To the extent that you can slow down this process of Trump, saying he's going to dismantle the department, that is really important. So delay. And then, hopefully the midterm elections will come around, and then that threat lessens. And that's what a lot of people who work in the bureaucracy, who are not very happy with, the current administration, they'll just kind of slow roll stuff, right? And that's partly what, we're seeing happen in the national news, and why Trump was really targeting the bureaucracy, because he felt like they were so unresponsive in his first term. And that's very typical of what bureaucrats do when they're not happy with the political kind of appointees that they're under. So delay is something that would be very important too. And that can be also done through the courts as well. So, as you know better than I do.
Well, the one place I sort of disagree with you is
Just the one.
We've both you and I, Eleanor, have been in the federal government in a lot of different roles.
Yeah.
And you see this as reverting to the mean at some point as this being an aberration, and we're going to go back to where it is. Um, I'm not. I don't buy that. I think this is a fundamental change in the way government's going to be structured and how American society is going to exist. And I think that from my point of view, it's our job to craft this new reality in a way that's beneficial for kids with disabilities, um, and not just to hope that that this bad smell goes away.
How do you propose we do that?
Well, I think that's involvement. I think it's I think that um, I would be focusing much more on what can be done on the state level and less on preserving what's being done on the federal level.
Mhm.
I say that today, but I am the government relations co-chair of COPA, and so
I was going to just bring
those
that up.
days I'll say something different.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to say was for anyone who doesn't know, SEEK does a tremendous amount on the state level. On the federal level, we have the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates, and they also do quite a bit. So that's another great organization to support and be a part of. It's also a great resource for parents.
And Eleanor, you brought it up before. Come back to the issue of what happened yesterday in terms of funding of the research arm of the Department of Education.
It's awful. I mean, research is so important, and it's just very myopic and short-sighted. And like I think I emailed you earlier. I don't know if any of you guys have read the Walter Isaacson biography of Trump not Trump, Musk, that came out in
Yeah, I did the
2003.
same thing.
Yeah, but it's just like, I mean, he's just a scorched earth kind of person. I mean, that's what he did at Twitter too. And he has a very, very huge kind of chip on his shoulder about the federal government, given his experience at SpaceX, that he kind of ran circles around NASA and being able to get things done much more quickly. So it's just very short-sighted to not fund research, which is vitally important that we have, documented procedures to help kids and help educate kids better.
Expand on that. Why is research so important?
Because you can have the best practices for teaching kids to read or working with disabled kids. I mean, we all know why the research is so important, and it's just very myopic.
Scientifically based, right? That's research,
Scientifically based. Yeah, it's policy too. Yeah,
right. And without it, we saw how great we taught kids to read.
right.
So,
And kids are still not recovered from the COVID learning losses either. I mean, it's
no, and isn't there research
not
now?
good.
They thought the older kids have kind of gone through and it would be over. Were you telling me that and now they're realizing no, the younger kids were actually very much impacted by it as well. And so
Yeah.
it's not over yet.
No.
So I know we have a hard stop.
Yes.
I don't know if there are other questions.
Well,
Let me see.
we were going to end every Seek Speaks with asking our guest to tell us something, to give us some hope. What's your nugget of hope here?
I think that education is just a very important policy area in American society that touches so many people. And I think parents and really well-meaning people like you, I think we'll get through. And I also just want to say how much I admire the work that you guys are doing on behalf of families and kids. And thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I think not seeing any more questions, I'm going to thank Professor Schiff and our other participants, Mr. Feinstein and Ms. Jonson, for your insightful discussion of this. Seek will be streaming this, so it will be available to the public very shortly, as soon as the people who are competent to do things like that do that. And we look forward to future Seek Speaks. At the end of February, we will have our own Julie Swanson talking about the autism set up here in the state, and we are going to be introducing special programs like this one with policymakers, so you will have ample opportunity to talk to other people. Again, we thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very
We
much.
look forward to
Thanks.
seeing you all again. And to those of you in the audience, please feel free to help fund Seek in our efforts going forward. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.